Emily Carter had always dreamed of living in an old house. There was something about the charm of creaky floorboards, stained glass windows, and the whispers of history that drew her in. So, when she found the Victorian-era home on Willow Lane, she knew it was meant to be. The house was a two-story structure with a wraparound porch, a steeply pitched roof, and intricate woodwork that hinted at its former grandeur. It was nestled at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by towering oak, trees that cast long shadows over the property. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper, but to Emily, it was perfect. She moved in on a crisp autumn day, her golden retriever, Toby, bounding excitedly through the empty rooms. Toby was her constant companion, a loyal, affectionate dog with a knack for sensing her moods. He had been with her through the hardest years of her life, and she couldn't imagine being in this new chapter without him. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking, painting, and settling in. Emily loved every inch of the house, from the bay windows in the living room to the clawfoot tub in the bathroom. But there was one part of the house she avoided: the basement. The basement door was at the end of the hallway on the first floor. It was an old, heavy door with a tarnished brass handle and a keyhole that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Emily had opened it once when she first moved in, but the damp, musty smell and the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever had made her quickly close it again. She told herself she'd explore it later, but later never came. Chapter 2. The staring it started about a month after moving in. Emily was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she noticed Toby sitting in the hallway. He was perfectly still, his ears pricked forward and his tail unmoving. At first she thought he was waiting for her to finish so they could go for a walk. "Just a minute, buddy," she said, drying her hands on a towel. But when she turned around, Toby hadn't moved. He was staring at the basement door. "Toby," she called, walking over to him. She knelt beside him and followed his gaze. The door was closed, just as it always was. There was nothing unusual about it, no sounds, no movement, but Toby was fixated, as if he could see something she couldn't. "Come on, let's go outside," she said, trying to coax him away. But Toby didn't budge. He let out a soft whine, his body tense. Emily frowned. This wasn't like him. Toby was usually so responsive, so eager to please, but now it was like he was in a trance. She stood and walked to the door, placing her hand on the handle. Toby's whine turned into a low growl, and he backed away, his tail tucked between his legs. Okay, I won't open it," she said, holding up her hands in surrender. She didn't know why, but Toby's reaction made her uneasy. She decided to leave the door alone for now. Chapter 3. The first encounter over the next few days, Toby's behavior became more concerning. He would sit in the hallway for hours staring at the basement door. Sometimes he would let out a soft whine or a low growl, but he never barked. It was as if he was trying to warn her about something, but she couldn't understand what. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Emily came home to find Toby in his usual spot. She sighed and set her bag down. "Toby, come on, let's go outside." She snapped her fingers, but Toby didn't move. Frustrated, she walked over to him and placed a hand on his back. He flinched, as if startled, but still didn't look at her. His breathing was shallow, his eyes wide. Emily frowned. This wasn't like him. "Okay, buddy, what's going on?" she murmured, kneeling beside him. She followed his gaze to the door. It looked the same as it always did, old, wooden, with a brass handle that had tarnished over time. But Toby was acting like it was something else, something alive. Emily stood and walked to the door. She placed her hand on the handle and glanced back at Toby. His ears flattened against his head, and a low whine escaped his throat. "It's just the basement, Toby," she said, trying to sound reassuring. But her own heart was starting to race. Why was he so scared? She turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, and a rush of cold air swept up from the darkness below. Toby let out a sharp, piercing scream, a sound Emily had never heard him make before. It was a mix of a howl and a cry filled with pure terror. He scrambled backward, his claws scraping against the hardwood floor, and bolted down the hallway. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "Toby!" she called, but he was already gone, hiding somewhere in the house. She stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the abyss of the basement. The air felt heavier now, almost oppressive. She flicked the light switch, but the bulb flickered weakly before going out entirely. "Great," she muttered, pulling out her phone and turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the steep staircase that led down to the basement. She hesitated. Should she go down there? Toby's reaction had shaken her, but it was just a basement, right? Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned under her weight, and she gripped the railing tightly. The air grew colder with each step, and the beam of her flashlight seemed to grow dimmer, as if the darkness was swallowing it whole. When she reached the bottom, she swept the light around the room. The basement was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs. Everything looked normal, but the atmosphere felt wrong, like she wasn't alone. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, but she could have sworn she heard a faint whisper just on the edge of her hearing. She spun around, shining the light in every direction, but there was nothing there. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a door. It was small, barely tall enough for a child to walk through, and made of the same old wood as the rest of the house. But what caught Emily's attention was the symbol carved into it, a strange, intricate design that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never seen this door before. How could she have missed it? She took a step closer, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The symbol seemed to draw her in, pulling her toward the door like a moth to a flame. And then she heard it again, the whisper. This time it was clearer. It was a voice, soft and melodic, calling her name. "Emily." She froze. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The air around her grew colder, and the beam of her flashlight flickered. The voice didn't respond, but the door began to creak open, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to stretch on forever. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She couldn't look away from the door, from the endless void beyond it. And then, from the darkness, something emerged. It was a hand, pale and skeletal with long, claw-like fingers. It reached out toward her, and Emily finally found the strength to move. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping her phone, and turned to run up the stairs. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, and she didn't stop running until she was back in the hallway, gasping for breath. Toby was there, waiting for her. He pressed himself against her legs, trembling violently. Emily sank to the floor, pulling him into her arms. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Toby let out a soft whine and licked her hand as if trying to comfort her. But his eyes kept darting back to the basement door, which was now closed once more. Emily knew one thing for certain. She would never open that door again. Chapter 4. The Research Begins. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling exhausted. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about what she had seen in the basement. Toby was curled up at the foot of her bed, his head resting on his paws. He looked up at her with those soulful brown eyes, and she could tell he was still on edge. "Good morning, buddy," she said softly, scratching behind his ears. Let's figure this out, okay? She made herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. If the house had a history, she needed to know about it. She started by searching for the address, but there wasn't much information online. The house was old, but it seemed to have flown under the radar for most of its existence. Frustrated, Emily decided to visit the local library. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, was a elderly woman who had lived in the town her entire life. If anyone knew about the house, it would be her. "Ah yes, the old Grayson house," Mrs. Henderson said when Emily described the property. Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if she was sharing a secret. "That house has quite a history, built in 1923 by a wealthy businessman named Harold Grayson. He lived there with his wife and daughter until the tragedy." Emily's stomach dropped. What tragedy? Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her eyes darting around as if she was afraid someone might overhear. Harold's daughter, Clara, disappeared when she was just 8 years old. They never found her. The family moved out shortly after, and the house changed hands several times over the years. Some say it's haunted. Emily's mind raced. Could Clara's disappearance be connected to the door in the basement? She thanked Mrs. Henderson and spent the next few hours poring over old newspapers and records. She found a faded article from 1931 about Clara's disappearance. According to Fairport, Clara had last been seen playing near the basement. The police had searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no trace of her. Emily's hands trembled as she read the article. She couldn't shake the feeling that the small door in the basement was somehow connected to Clara's disappearance. Chapter 5. The Whispering Voice. That night, Emily was awakened by a sound. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as she listened, it grew louder, a soft, melodic whisper. Emily. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. Toby was already awake, his ears pricked forward and his body tense. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Emily, come to the door." She wanted to ignore it, to pull the covers over her head and pretend she hadn't heard anything, but something compelled her to get out of bed. Toby followed close behind, his tail tucked between his legs. The hallway was dark, but a faint light seemed to emanate from beneath the basement door. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she approached it. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Open." "The door, Emily." She reached for the handle, her hand trembling. Toby let out a low growl, but she barely heard him. Her fingers closed around the cold brass, and she turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness of the basement. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Emily's flashlight flickered as she descended the stairs, Toby reluctantly following behind. The small door was there again, just as she had seen it before. The symbol on it seemed to glow faintly, and the air around it was icy cold. Emily's breath came out in visible puffs as she stepped closer. And then she heard it. A child's laughter, soft and distant. It was coming from behind the door. Chapter 6. The Hidden Room. Emily's curiosity overpowered her fear. She reached out and pushed the small door open. The darkness beyond seemed to stretch endlessly, but as she shone her flashlight inside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a room, a small hidden room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to Theon on the door. In the center of the room was a child's doll, its porcelain face cracked, and its eyes staring blankly at her. But what horrified her the most was the photograph on the wall. It was an old, faded picture of a little girl, Clara Grayson. She was smiling, but her eyes looked hollow, almost lifeless. Emily stumbled backward, her mind reeling. Toby let out a sharp bark, snapping her out of her daze. She turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. Chapter 7. The History. unfolds over the next few days, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the hidden room. She knew she had to confront whatever was down there, but she was terrified of what she might find. She decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. She visited the town's historical society and spent hours sifting through old records. She learned that Harold Grayson had been a wealthy businessman with a dark secret. He had been involved in occult practices, and rumors swirled that he had performed rituals in the basement. Emily's heart sank as she read through the documents. It was clear that Harold had been a deeply troubled man, and his obsession with the occult had likely led to Clara's disappearance. Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation. One night, armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, Emily returned to the basement. Toby stayed by her side, his presence giving her courage. When she opened the small door, the room was different. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy. The doll was gone, replaced by a small, shadowy figure. It was Clara. Her ghostly form stood in the center of the room, her eyes filled with sadness. "Help me," she whispered. Emily's fear melted into pity. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. Clara's story unfolded in fragments, a tale of betrayal, dark rituals, and a father who had sacrificed her to something unspeakable. The small door was a gateway, and Clara's spirit had been trapped there for decades. With Toby's help, Emily performed a ritual to free Clara's spirit, using the knowledge she had gathered from her research. As the final symbol was drawn, the room filled with light, and Clara's ghostly form dissolved into the air. The basement was silent once more, the small door now just an ordinary piece of wood. Emily and Toby returned upstairs, exhausted but relieved.